Welcome to Writers Talk, the podcast where writers talk about writing. I'm Christopher. Today, my co-host is Mia Botha, and we're going to be talking about setting and the setting workbook, which is on Writers Write.The. This is going to be a instructional podcast where Mia is going to teach me and everyone else the basics about setting that you can then find out more from her workbook. All right, Mia, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, Chris, thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk about writing and especially about setting.
Yes, and I mean, setting is such an important thing. And a lot of people either, I think too much about it or think too little about it when they're making their story. I know that a lot of people might spend years and years on their setting and not so much time on the plot, or vice versa. You might just have this plot that exists in a void. But Mia's here to correct us and put us in our place and tell us where exactly setting goes in the writing process.
No, don't worry. Your place is in front of your computer. That's the only place that you have to be. So setting is one of those things. Okay, so unfortunately, I mean, if writing were easy, we'd only be able to focus on one thing and say, if we get this right, the book will be great. But unfortunately,
there's seven things, right, that we need to think about with setting.
Yeah.
And let's just name those first so we can, everyone has an idea what we're going through, right? So we're going to be talking about the physical location, then the era, objectives and things, the duration.
Yeah, objects that your character is surrounded with,
Right. Weather, culture, and geography. Those are all the aspects of setting that we need to consider, right?
Yeah, so setting is a pretty big thing. So if you had to think of making a painting, it doesn't matter how beautiful the landscape is you paint, how beautiful the character is you paint. If that thing doesn't go on a canvas, it isn't a painting. And the same way, it helps to think about setting in the same way. The setting is like the foundation of your story and where it takes place, and it helps you to create a beginning, a middle, and an end for your story. So it's really a really big part of the story. Okay, it influences pretty much every aspect of your story and of your plot.
So in your analogy, setting is the canvas that you paint the story onto. So it's going to determine whether you're making an oil painting or water painting or a fresco, so to speak.
Yeah, that's all up to you as the writer to do whatever you can, but all of those have to go on a canvas or a piece of paper. So what tends to happen is with writers, we tend to think that setting is primarily world building and it's for genres like fantasy and sci-fi. And of course, it is incredibly important in those genres, but don't underestimate the need and the value of setting in your story. We need to simply know where the story takes place. So that's your physical location. It can be as small as the room that Emma Donoghue starts her story in. It can be as big as a city, an entire world that we build in fantasy or sci-fi. But quite simply, where does your story take place? If your story takes place in the South of America, if it takes place in Antarctica, if it takes place in Australia, those are all the big influences in your story. So the physical location, ask yourself quite simply, where is my character when this is happening?
So I suppose the misconception there is that it's not important to pay attention to your setting if you're just setting it in the current day.
Yeah, so people would for example, say, okay, but it's a present day story. Everyone knows everything. But that setting does so much for your story in terms of giving it substance and giving your character stuff to do and places to go. So the setting really has such a big influence on it. So if you think, that brings us to our next point, which is era. Okay, so past, present, or future, when is your story taking place? An example we can use here is communication. If your story is set in the past, how do your characters communicate? Do you have to send a letter across the globe in a boat, which you hope won't sink somewhere when it rounds the Cape of Good Hope? And, it takes 4 or 6 or even up to a year to receive news of your family, home, or whatever. So that is what your era does for you. Present day, it would be really weird if you told a story without cell phones and social media. So all of that's going to influence your story. If you set your story in the future, you need to figure out how would they communicate in the future. Do you have telepathy? Do they, get to type on using funny little screens and blinking their eyes? Okay, so how would your characters communicate? That is what your era does for you.
It is funny that you say that, because a lot of, I think, older stories have been adapted to the modern world, and it's painfully obvious that they don't use any of the technology available to them to communicate their ideas. No one phones anyone or anything like that. It's such a weird thing to have in your current day.
I read a story the other day, and I can't remember who the author was, but it took place, the character was waiting next to the fax machine, and she was describing how this fax on this waxy paper and the smudged printing was coming out. And it was such an odd thing. I was like, oh my goodness, I forgot about that. And the fax that falls under the table and gets torn off. So it was such an interesting thing. And it was such an effective way to establish the setting. Because, I mean, when last did you receive a fax on waxy rolled up paper?
I can't even, I don't know. I don't know if I ever have.
You're giving away your age. So am I.
Although, I mean, it's something to consider, because not everywhere in the world has the same technology available or chooses to. I know, for instance, in Asia, they still do use fax machines quite a lot for business purposes. So maybe that's something to consider with setting, is when you're looking at your physical location, it's going to change how people deal with physical technology and the way they interact with things.
Yeah. And that's something you have to get right in your setting, because if you get that wrong, everyone's going to go, but okay. I mean, imagine setting your story in some really rural area and your character's in trouble, and suddenly they whip out their cell phone and they phone somebody, and when people go there and they live there or whatever, they'll go, but there is no cell phone reception in that area. So it's small things like that we have to get right.
Right. And that plays into era.
Yeah, that everything has to do with your era. So ask yourself, past, present, or future, when does my story take place?
And what's harder? I mean, setting it right now, setting it 10 years ago, setting it 100 years ago.
Obviously, if you set your story in the past, you have a lot of research to do and you have to get it right. If you set your story in present day, it seems simpler, but it comes down to writing what you know. So are you really comfortable with the setting you're setting it in? Is it the hometown that you grew up in? Then it's going to be fairly simple for you. If you are setting it in present day, but in a place you're not familiar with, you still have work to do. If you're setting in the future, you have to make it up. So fun, but it's definitely something that you have to work very hard at. So I don't think anyone is easier or harder. It's just something you have to decide what you want to do.
I suppose that it just sort of comes down to research at that point. I mean, if you're setting it in the modern era, and like, say, for instance, you're a teacher or something, it's going to be difficult to write a crime procedural without doing a lot of research about how such a thing actually works.
Yeah,
I mean, unless you're just going to ignore all of that as part of the story.
I mean, yeah, of course, there's a lot of things, there's creative license, so you can pretty much do whatever you want. But if you do want to get it right, it's something that you have to pay attention to. In South Africa, we refer to police files as dockets, whereas in America, obviously, it's the file. So we watch so much American television that we sometimes forget when we set our stories in South Africa that we might have a different process, or just a simple different name for a file. So those are all kinds of things that we have to be aware of when we choose our setting.
Right. Yeah. And you commonly you hear, you have the right to remain silent when someone's arrested in an American drama. And there's a British version of that as well, which is quite different. If you watch a lot of British TV, you'll hear it. I can't remember what it is right now, but yeah, and those are the things probably just to pay attention to.
Those are the small things that's going to help you add authenticity to your story. And that's, once again, what the setting will do for you.
But I suppose if you are setting it like 100 to 200 years ago, there won't be any of that procedure. And that's something to bear in mind.
Yeah, they might have had something different that they said at this stage. What were the court proceedings?
They just knocked you over the head and put the handcuffs on.
Yeah, kind of dragged you away. I mean, if you start looking at mob justice and public hangings, It's very different to what we had today. I think with the story of Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace comes to mind. And it is, large parts of that story take place in the courtroom, and she did it beautifully. She explained it, but I think she also speaks about the research that she had to do to get it right for that time that she set her story in.
Well, so that era is going to have its own things, right? Its own objects, and that's something we need to bear in mind, that your setting is going to have unique bits and bobs that will make it feel real.
Yeah, those bits and bobs are how you sneak your setting into your story. Okay.
Right.
Like a boring way to, well, not boring way, but it's effective, to just start with a date and the location of your story at the top of your chapter. But if you had to have your character whipping out a paper map and a compass instead of programming a GPS, can you see how that is immediately, those objects and things are grounding your story for you? It's quite a simple thing. Ask yourself what your character is surrounded by. If your character is a writer in the Victorian times, they're not going to whip out a ballpoint pen. They're going to have a feather and a quill. If you set it in present day, it's going to be, you can speak about a writer who writes by hand, but most of the time those writers are going to take out their computers and start typing on laptops or on desktops. So the objects and the things that you surround yourself with, or that your character surrounds himself with, is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of your setting. The same thing with clothing. What is your character wearing? Go back to when you've set your story. Is it a latex space suit because you've set your story in the future? Is it a ball gown with hoops and millions of petticoats? Or is it present day and they're wearing, I don't know what kind of shoes are cool lately, like Converse sneakers or whatever. Those are all things that are going to help you. Wrong person. Yeah, I'm like desperately trying to think which shoes are cool. But yeah, those are all the things that are going to help you to convey your setting in a simple manner.
So it sort of seems maybe there's objects that ground your setting, and maybe objects that distinguish your character.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say? So if they are going to be a writer, for example, and they're going to be a writer in 2021, and they're going to go into a Starbucks and start writing, everyone's going to expect they're going to write on some sort of computer, right? Probably an Apple, because that's the stereotype. But if they drag a typewriter in with them, I mean, that's going to tell you more about the character than the era. Some sort of maybe an obnoxious hippie kind of vibe about dragging in your moleskin books and your fountain pen.
The objects that your character owns say so much about who they are. The choice of a Apple computer versus any other kind of computer, the kind of notebooks that they write in, that's all ways that you can use to show your character. So that just goes to show again that your writing can never do one thing. Not only are you showing us the setting, you're showing us who that character is as well. So that is where you know that you have grasped a very important detail, as opposed to just a rudimentary detail. Okay, so your writing must always try and do double duty. So if you squeeze setting and character into one detail, that's fantastic.
But I mean, it shows the importance of the setting, though, because if you were just having your writer write in a coffee shop, by a hand with a pen or on paper, I mean, that would be normal in the 80s, I assume, for someone to be doing. But you'd have to set up the setting, make it clear it's a computer era now, and people aren't doing that anymore for it to be noteworthy as far
Absolutely.
as anything.
Yeah, I mean, if you think let's pretend we're going to have a scene in Starbucks and everyone's fighting to sit in the seat near the plugs, because for some other reason there's never enough plugs for you to charge your computer while you write. And this guy walks in with his very heavy typewriter, so obviously he's very dedicated, and he can sit at any table because he doesn't need to charge. So that's a very simple example, but it would work. I'm just thinking of an example. I cannot remember the name of the book, but it's one of Stephen King's stories where he has a writer, I think almost with an alter ego. I haven't read it in a really long time, but when he was his everyday person, he wrote, I think, with pens on a typewriter. But when he became this alter ego, he wrote with a very specific black pencil. So that was such a nice way for him to show who the character was again. And once again, when you look at the setting, I don't think there were computers. It was literally the writer chose between a pen and a pencil. I have to go research that again. But that just came to mind as it was doing setting and showing characters. That was one of the ways for him to show how he was changing his personality in that stage.
Yeah, I can't remember who that is either, but Stephen King is notorious for having his main character be a writer.
Yes, well,
and living in Maine.
life imitates art.
Okay. And what do you mean by duration here, Mia? What does that tell us about setting?
Your story can take place in a matter of hours. It can take place over a few days, weeks, months, years. I mean, you can have generational stories which start with grandmother, granddaughter, granddaughter. Okay, that all has to do with the duration of your story, which will influence your setting. If you tell your story in 24 hours, for example, you can't exactly have your characters circumvent the globe unless they are in a very special spaceship and $1 million or millionaire who wants to go and zip around the planet in 24 hours. But just go think about the duration of your story. That's also a tool that can help you as a beginner writer, because sometimes we struggle with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're not quite sure how long our story should be, when should we stop our story. So by introducing an event that your character works towards, if it is a rom-com about getting married, the wedding date would be a specific day that they can work towards, which will help you to know when to end your story. But yeah, so the duration of your story is literally how long it's going to take, and that influences what you can expect in terms of how much you can add into your story.
So going back to your earlier points, maybe about genres fitting into the setting, it seems like this is a good example of, a short duration would be good for a crime, or some sort of action genre. Then your rom-com might be like a medium length, I suppose, and maybe a family drama, like you say, a multi-generational family drama would be your long one. Perhaps science fiction can also take place over, sometimes thousands of years.
That really. Yeah, it really depends on the story that you're telling. I mean, in terms of the length of the story, it's never really going to change in terms of word count. So you only have that much story that you can fit in. But whether you tell that story over, I mean, you can still fit a 100-year story into 80,000 words by skipping over quite a few things. So that duration, but in terms of action, a simple example would be if your character has to get to a certain place, they have 48 hours to deliver X amount of money for an action story, and it's about a kidnapped child, and the people have 48 hours to deliver the money. That will automatically give you a time frame to work in, which is really going to help you, especially in the beginning of your stories. But yeah, the rom-coms, think of things like working towards a promotion or a wedding, a new job date or something like that, graduation, anything that has a certain time frame that's going to help you to structure your story around. What was the story? No, I can't remember. But let's say the events of the story take place over 7 days. Then I have 7 days to do it. But once again, you're not going to go through every single second. You're just going to highlight the most important things. You can have crime novels where they spend years hunting for a serial killer, and he comes and goes. I mean, if you think of Red John and The Mentalist, I mean, it took a while to catch him. I mean, I think it was 7 or 8 seasons, wasn't it? Not that I know.
I mean, I'm sure there's an exception to everything, but probably an action story is best when it happens over a shorter period of time, for example. But you might want to, something like June or Foundation. I'm just thinking, I mean, what happens over the course of like 10,000 years? What happens over the course of 4,000 years? I mean, it's probably suited to like a weird philosophical kind of rambling kind of science fiction story, generally speaking. I mean, of course you can have short action and science fiction or fantasy or crime that takes place over all of these cold case kind of crime stories that happen 20 years after the crime. That's also a common genre.
The scope of the story Yeah, the scope of the story really depends on which part you want to tell and what you want to focus on. So, I mean, if you think of a story of a murder, or if a sad topic, if you think of a person who was a survivor of a violent crime, how long was that violent crime really? I mean, usually that's a matter of minutes. But the major part of the story is how they survive and how they overcome that, which is much longer. So that is, yeah, you need to decide as the writer what part of that story you want to focus on. But it is going to help you to figure out what the time frame is and pick a duration and work with that.
Right. Okay. I mean, that makes sense.
I hope so.
So weather though, I mean, how does that affect our setting? I mean, I can see some obvious ways, obviously, dark and stormy nights and such. But,
yes, the dark and stormy nights. Obviously, yeah, the thing with weather is, I mean, any story takes place anywhere. I was reading, I just have to check the author's name. I think it was called The Dry by Jane Harper, if I'm right. Yes, Jane Harper, The Dry. It was very interesting. She said her story in Australia, and this community is really affected by a drought. But and that obviously has huge influence on the plot because it's a farming community. So, and they have to solve a violent crime. And while they're investigating the crime, that part of the motive that could emerge for this crime was the fact that the weather was really bad, the farmer was in financial trouble, etc., etc. So that was actually what was influenced by the weather. But she conveyed it so well. At like some point, it feels like you have dust in your mouth. She's describing this dry so well. So, I mean, if you think of something, if you set your story in a very rainy, cold, dark place, it's going to be odd if you have your character traipsing around in flip-flops and a t-shirt when it's really cold and miserable. But that might also be part of showing the character. So go and investigate what the weather is of your story. I mean, if you're telling the story about a tsunami on a small island, that's obviously going to have a huge effect. Okay, so lovely sunshiny days in the beginning, and then it's going to be a lot darker and gloomier after the bad events. So the weather, the challenge is always not to be, cliched and to do the expected thing, but to try and set the tone using your weather. But I mean, obviously, we can think a little bit further than, dark and gloomy weather versus, ooh, the character is sad. Why don't you try opposites? Okay, if it's a gloriously sunshiny day and your character is still depressed and doesn't want to leave. So you can use weather in things like that to do it. But yeah, think of things like storms, think of floods, think of beautiful days, think of days spoilt by bad weather. Okay, so what can you do? I'm thinking of that. What was it? Perfect Squall, which was that story. I don't know if it was a book, but I definitely watched the movie about those young boys who are on that beautiful boat, and then they're trapped in this was considered to be the perfect storm. Weather has a huge influence in that story. It's often a catalyst as well. I'm just thinking, I don't know if you've watched Outer Banks on Netflix, and the first season starts with a storm. That first episode. So there's a huge storm, a boat sinks, these kids find the boat, and they find something in the boat which gives them a story goal and sends them on their quest. So try not to start with a dark and stormy night, but the weather is definitely a tool you can use to propel your story forward.
That certainly seems true. Not to go back to June too much, but I mean, Frank Herbert was very interested in the climate, and I mean, the first book in the series is basically about climate change. So yeah, I mean, you could base your entire plot on that aspect of the setting as well, I suppose. Just, how the weather affects people.
If you go look now, there's so many books coming out which focus on climate change. There's actually like a little subgenre, and it's called cli-fi, as in climate fiction. And people will just say, oh, it's a brand new genre. But if you actually go back into some of the classics, I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I read Circles in a Forest by Delia and Mattia. I don't know if you were ever subjected to the Elephant book. I loved it. I thought it was one of my favorite books, but it was about the deforestation. It was about the deforestation of the knives in the forests and about the elephants dying out and being poached. So, and that's a very old book. I mean, if I read it when I was in school. So there are many books that focus on the weather and on climate change. So, and I think Barbara Kingsolver writes about it a lot. It really does. It plays a huge part in those stories, if that's the focus that you want to take.
Okay. I think that covers weather. Culture seems also equally important, if maybe not even more so.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're all pretty important. But just think about cultures. I mean, setting your story in an Eastern culture versus a Western culture, it's going to make such a big difference. The one thing that I use when I teach this is to use an example, is to think about marriage. I mean, we all have a version of marriage in most cultures. And when you just go take a look at how marriage can differ from 100 years ago to present day, from east to west, just think about that, how different it is. Arranged marriages by choice, couples who choose not to get married, all of those things, that's all culture. Your food, your clothing, traditions, religion, all of that is influenced by culture. So it is, I mean, it seems like such an unassuming little point, but it's a huge part of your story.
I mean, is there any tip or shortcut that you have for writing in a different culture? Or is it just you have to know that culture very well to even entertain the idea of doing something that's slightly out of your home culture?
Know your stuff. And I always think it's important to deal with, to be very respectful of other cultures and what you're doing and why you are choosing to place it in that culture. And yeah, just be sure that you know what you're talking about. It was interesting. I don't know if you, oh goodness, I'm stuck on Netflix this week, but if you ever watched Unorthodox, which was last year, just as the big lockdown began, it came out, and it was such an interesting look into a very Orthodox Jewish community and about leaving out. And then obviously I read quite a few articles afterwards, but it was such an interesting look at that culture. And then just to, of course, see the articles that came out afterwards, they got this right, but they didn't get this right, and this was done. And so, I think there's always you run the risk of not getting it 100% right, but the aim is there to be as respectful and as correct as you possibly can be. So lots and lots of research.
So I suppose just to bring up an example, what's his name? James Clavell. He wrote Shogun, Noble House, those sort of books, which were about, one was about Japan, one was about Hong Kong. And it's interesting because he's clearly done a lot of research, and they were very popular books, and they have a sort of maybe adventurous kind of style about them. But they're also very wrong about the way he portrays the cultures. I mean, you couldn't imagine something that is more, it must be willfully misinterpreted about those sort of things, but they still worked very well. I don't know if it's just, the era that they're written in, at maybe like the 50s, 60s. I think there was a mini-series that was quite well known as well at that sort of time. But that's sort of mean you don't really have to get it right if your elements are interesting enough.
Yeah, I haven't read those or seen the series, so I really can't comment on that specifically. But yeah, I think there's an authenticity that comes through with what we call writing what you know. Okay, so a confident writer is a good writer. So if you are working on trying to put a lot of research into a story, it sometimes feels a bit forced. I don't know if you've ever read one of these books where you can kind of see that the writer has absolutely fallen in love with their research and they're trying to shoehorn as many facts into the story as possible. Whereas someone who is writing in a culture that they are very, very familiar with, it almost seems to come like it's a bit more natural to get it in there. Whereas if you're trying to shoehorn your research in there, it doesn't come across as simple as it was. So yeah, it really depends on the writer and on what their talent is and what they can pull off or not pull off. I mean, in some, there are always parts of books that don't work, but then there are other parts that are strong enough to make the book work, and vice versa. So there are things that will forgive a writer for certain things. I always say the story trumps everything. So if you get the story right and the story is engaging and exciting, we're willing to look past a few of the things that you might not have gotten right.
So I suppose what I'm wondering is if you're writing for a Western audience about another culture, do you have to overemphasize aspects of that culture in order to convey the setting? Because
It depends on,
normally when you're writing about the culture that you're immersed in, you're not going to bring the every aspect of that culture to the forefront, because it's just a background action to you. You'll only perhaps emphasize the one thing that maybe stands out as strange.
yeah, well, not even strange. You're gonna emphasize the one thing that is crucial to the plot. So if there is a specific tradition in that culture that would force that story into a certain direction, then it's important to emphasize it. But if it's just something that doesn't necessarily, I think you need to decide if it's going to influence the plot or not. And that's the important part. So otherwise, some things are nice to know and they can add to the authenticity, they can add to the setting. But always decide, does this advance my plot or doesn't it advance my plot? So that's where Kill Your Darlings comes from. Is it a nice to have or is it integral to the story?
Okay, fair enough. And lastly, geography. So and this one I will ask a little, obviously real world geography is very important and will affect your story. But this also brings up the topic of you can create your own geography and that will of course influence your setting.
That's why I love fantasy and sci-fi, because no one can argue with me if there's supposed to be a mountain or there isn't supposed to be a mountain. I put a mountain there. It's my world. I can put the mountains wherever I want.
Why is this desert next to the pole? Why is this jungle next to this volcano?
Yeah. Yes, it is because I decided to put it there and I needed my characters to go through a jungle. That is, so the geography of your story, go take a look. Setting your story in, a very cold Alaskan environment, or setting your story on the side of a mountain, or setting your story in a desert. That is all going to influence the characters, it's going to influence the story. I mean, if you're in a desert, you have to think about water a lot more than you would if you were in a contemporary setting with running water in a house with taps. Okay, so all of that's going to influence your story. So just decide where you do it. All of these elements, okay, so all 7 of these elements are important in a story, but they will move backwards and forwards in terms of importance depending on the kind of story it is that you're telling. Okay.
And geography sort of seems very interrelated to other aspects of these points. So if you said your thing in Africa or Asia, you're obviously going to be dealing with certain types of weather, certain types of culture. Duration might also be affected because travel is different in the different places you are. And I think probably era, because certain places have a kind of allure to a specific era in time.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of these things are so important. I mean, I'm just thinking of things like banking systems and how interesting I always find it that America, for example, still uses checks. Whereas, I mean, in South Africa, we haven't, I mean, have you ever had a checkbook? Have you ever written a check? I mean, I remember I was 19 when I got my first checkbook and I thought it was quite snazzy. And I don't think I've ever written out more than 2 checks. And we don't even get issued those anymore. So all of these things influences your story. It's setting.
That's true.
Yep.
I suppose, as you say, sort of in your description here, whether people use knives and forks or chopsticks, I mean, that's geography. I mean, and that's also like something you can point out just to give your reader a taste of the culture you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's weird to see a person use a fork in Asia, but maybe that's sort of that your spies kind of like give or tell that he's perfectly immersed in the culture, but he just can't get his head around chopsticks or something.
Yeah, it's some people make it look very, very easy and other people make it look very clumsy. So those are all little things. Like I said, it does your heavy lifting for you by weaving in these small little details that's going to really convey your setting for you.
Okay, so I suppose lastly, how do they all come together, Mia? What's the order? What do we start with?
You need to decide what the story is that you're going to tell. So, for example, sci-fi and fantasy, it's going to make sense to start with your world and your culture and what are the rules of this world. Why have you decided to set it in a different world? If you think of something like historical fiction, if you've set your story in World War II, you're going to, immediately be almost, it's like you're allocated what you need in that story. Like, what are the objects and things that we're surrounded by?
You'll know where you are because the battles that are happening. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you had to set your story during the World War II and you don't have a mention of war anywhere. I mean, even if you are telling a story in a very rural, very, very, secluded village somewhere hidden far away, at some point they're going to have to get news of this, or they're going to have to see these planes flying overhead or something.
Or someone can't get their coffee because it's there's U-boat raid.
It's shortages and all kinds of things like that. So by just deciding when, I suppose start with past, present, or future, and just decide where you're going to set it, or even the physical location. Start with your character and figure out where he lives, when he lives, what he does while he lives there.
And as you go through all of these 7 points, I suppose some of them will stand out, as you say, as more important than others.
Yeah, and that only depends on the story you're telling.
And this, is there any, so there's no hard and fast of what will be the most important point to you in your story. So long as you've considered each and every one of them, I suppose, at some point.
Yeah, use these 7 points as a little checklist. Okay, so when you've got your story, and it doesn't matter if it is a short story, if it is a novel you're writing, use that as a checklist. Okay, have I established a physical location? Have I thought about the era? Have I cemented it with objects and things? Have I decided on the duration? Did I mention the weather? I mean, if the weather has no influence on your short story, then I would say leave that out. But it's going to be really weird going through an 80,000 word story and you haven't once mentioned the weather. Okay. At some point, your character is going to have to grab a coat or grab an umbrella or take off a jacket. And that's your weather. Okay.
Or on the other hand, it would be bizarre if you mention the weather and you're on a space station, for example.
Yeah, but then it would be quite temperate, and you'd almost kind of miss, stepping outside and taking an umbrella or something.
The lack of weather would be the weather's influence.
Yeah, that would kind of be can we just have there's no day or night. It's just dark the whole time. If you think about the psychological effects of that, of never having that, we're so used to that passage of time, it's day, it's dark, it's night, it's daylight. This is when we do stuff. It all influences our story and our characters.
And sort of obviously your Liam Neeson sort of stuck in a mountain stories, your weather is going to be very important. But then your intergenerational sort of families genres, it's probably not going to matter so much.
Unless they're stuck in a 100-year drought. Okay. Yeah. And these, there's yet another child born into a drought. Okay. So it literally influences every single thing in your story.
I mean, it's interesting how everything here just can't be discarded in any way, shape, or form.
No, it's not for the faint of heart.
I think just one thing that to consider if you're writing speculative fiction is maybe the objects and things. I'm always struck by, I read a lot of old science fiction written in the 1920s, and they're often so wrong about the things we use in every day. And sometimes they get a thing right, but everything is very, very much influenced by what you're using right now, I think, and people assuming it's just going to be a better version of that. No one really anticipated iPads and iPhones and being able just to access information wherever you are. You always had these ideas of, yeah.
I'm quickly looking up because it was so interesting. I don't know if you've ever read, it's a short story by Ray Bradbury called The Felt. And I'm just checking the date now. It was published in 1950. Right. And it is this story about this house, which they bought the house because it cooks your food for you. The children's playroom changes into this miraculous setting. So specifically, it's called the Veld because for that stage, the kids had it set to this African bush veld with these lions. So you walk into this room, and it is so cool to see that, you know, I mean, 1950, how many years ago was that? You get to do the math. I'm not going to do it.
71, yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing to see how he did it. And when I read it, I was so struck about the timelessness of the story, because even though we're not in a house that can cook your food for you and automatically cleans itself and changes its walls to create a different landscape for the children, it almost feels like it's still possible. So that was very, very interesting to take a look at, and the importance that setting played in that story, because setting was such a huge source of conflict. I think that's one thing that we also underestimate, is that we focus so much on the emotional conflict of the characters, what they're going through, the internal conflict, and, you know, having fights with each other and, you know, arguments and stuff like that, that we sometimes underestimate that setting is also a huge source of our conflict. You know, if you think about bad weather, it can throw off so many things, and it can force problems and create arguments for the characters. So it's really a wonderful tool.
That's just one of the things I was thinking about, was sort of Arthur Clarke and also Robert Heinlein. They often had characters where they were so right about you having a desk that is dedicated to doing something on a computer, right? And I mean, and they'd be talking to their device, which, I mean, I don't think most people do, but some people do. And
Dictaphones
you know,
are huge.
getting information back and forth, and, you know, they'd be able to access something like the internet. But, you know, then they'd step away from that stationary device and have no form of mobile communication for the rest of the story. You know, 400 years in the future, be getting on their automatic car, going all about things, and no one can contact them while they're out of their house. Sort of idea, you know.
Sounds idyllic at this stage.
And what I was wondering when I brought up objects and things is maybe it's best to do as little as possible with them in order to achieve some sort of semblance of realism in speculative fiction. I don't know what you feel about that. I mean, obviously, if it's your sort of gimmick kind of universe like Star Trek or something like that, it's fine. Have phasers, have teleporters, have all that. That's the fun of the story. But if you are trying to go for something that's more realistic, or you don't want your characters to be always solving their problems with technology, maybe it's best to leave it out as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of a story like Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is, I mean, so close, but actually it's not a technology heavy story. That's primarily to do with culture, with laws being changed, with rights being changed. You know, it's like, if you think it's just the law, like no bank accounts for women and stuff like that. I think that's almost what makes it so eerily realistic, is the fact that, you know, there isn't a huge sci-fi techie element to it.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a story that, you know, is set in the future but doesn't have as many techie devices and things. But yeah, I think it's to be careful with it, because I mean, I think that's what I was speaking about, that Ray Bradbury story. It offers a timelessness to the story. I think what you're trying to say is you have something that actually dates your story, that makes it, you know, anchors it in a very, very specific era or a specific time, that could work to your advantage or to your disadvantage. I mean, if you think of a story, I mean, I'm thinking of Phone Booth, where the whole concept is about the guy stuck in a telephone booth and there's a sniper and he can't get off the phone. And would that story work today? But then there's the story about, I'm bad at remembering story names today, about the woman who was kidnapped and she manages to make the phone work, and she gets through to this one guy on a cell phone. And even though he's mobile, he can't put down this phone. So use it to your advantage, or to help you or not to help you.
So it's just a thing to think about, really. As
definitely.
all these things are. Okay, Mia. So thanks so much for talking to us about this today. Maybe we can talk a little bit more in detail about it some other time. But that'll be it for today. And I'd just like to thank you for being here and ask you, where can people find you online?
First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, you can find me. I blog for writing.The every Wednesday, usually. You'll be able to find some of my posts there. Otherwise, you can find me at miabotha.com or at deadlinesforwriters.com. If you would like to find out more about this topic, you can go take a look at the setting workbook. You will find it on writerswrite.co.za. And I have included lots of descriptions in that work, or lots of examples in that workbook to explain all of these 7 points. And I hope that will use you to help you to write wonderful stories.
Thanks so much for being with us, Mia.
It's such a pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
This has been Writers Talk. My name is Christopher. You can find me on Twitter at ChristopherLukeD, or you can find me on writerswrite.co.za. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.